Welcome, dear friends, to our channel. If stories of love, loss, and redemption move your heart, I invite you to stay with us, subscribe, and walk alongside these journeys of family and fate. Today, we open a story that may well remind you of how fragile yet powerful the bonds of family truly are. Now, let us begin. You don't even fit to be called our mother. The words cracked like a whip in the stale afternoon air, echoing against peeling wallpaper and the worn wooden floorboards. Her son, once a boy who clung to her hand when storms rattled the windows, now stood tall, arms folded, his jaw clenched with shame. His sister, lips pressed thin, looked away as if the sight of their mother were a stain on her carefully ironed dress. She stood there silently, her shoulders stooped, but her dignity intact. Her coat was threadbare, its seams fraying like the edges of her life. In her trembling hand, she still held the small paper bag of groceries she had managed to buy after her night shift, a carton of milk, a loaf of day-old bread, a gesture of care that went unseen, unwanted. Outside, the Alabama sky was the color of ash. The neighborhood children were laughing somewhere down the street, but inside that room, silence pressed heavier than winter frost. The cruelty of her children's words did not come from strangers. That was the wound. Strangers had overlooked her all her life. Strangers had passed her by on the road without a glance. But to be erased by her own flesh and blood, there is a kind of suffering no doctor can diagnose, no medicine can soothe. And yet she did not shout back. She did not curse them. Instead, she whispered the same words she had repeated through decades of hunger and long shifts at the diner. Love is greater than money. They rolled their eyes. They did not see the quiet power in that mantra. They did not yet know how those words would haunt them. Years later, when the truth of her hidden inheritance came crashing down. But for now, she picked up the paper bag, pressed it to her chest as if it were a shield, and stepped into the cold, where even the wind seemed kinder than her own children. Before we judge her children too harshly, let us go back to the days when life had not yet bent her body, when hope still flickered in her chest like a candle fighting against the wind. She had been born in a clapboard house on the outskirts of Montgomery, Alabama, sometime in the early 1930s. The Great Depression still left its fingerprints on every broken fence and empty pantry. Her father worked odd jobs when he could, hammering nails for pennies, patching roofs no one else wanted to touch. Her mother sewed patches upon patches so that each dress looked like a quilt of survival. By the time she was 12, she knew the weight of hunger more intimately than the taste of sugar. She walked barefoot to school, the soles of her feet hardened from gravel roads. And when it rained, she pretended to enjoy the puddles because they disguised the holes in her shoes. Yet even then, she carried a sketchbook made from scraps of paper, drawing flowers over the torn leather of her shoes as if beauty could be painted into existence. At 16, she left school to work in a textile mill. The air inside was thick with lint, making her cough until her ribs ached, but the wages helped keep her siblings fed. It was there that she learned how to endure, how to keep moving forward even when each day felt like a mountain. And then came love. Not the kind written in novels, but the kind built from shared hardships. A young man with calloused hands, a laborer like herself. They married in a small church, exchanging vows beneath a cracked wooden cross. For a few short years, there was laughter in their home. 3 children, born close together, filled her arms and exhausted her nights. But fate, as it so often does, proved merciless. A factory accident took her husband when the youngest child was still learning to walk. No life insurance, no savings, just her, the children, and the endless road of sacrifice ahead. So she worked, night shifts at the diner, cleaning homes of the wealthy, stitching clothes until her fingers bled. She never thought of herself as poor, not in spirit. She measured wealth in the warmth of her children's cheeks when they slept, in the tiny smiles when she brought home a surprise, an orange, a peppermint stick, a second-hand toy from the church bazaar. Still, poverty left scars. It whispered to her children as they grew, teaching them shame before they even understood gratitude. She ignored the whispers, believing love alone would be enough. She told herself that sacrifice would one day be recognized, that her children would see what she had carried for them. But life, as we know, is not always fair. And in the shadows of that unfairness, betrayal was already taking root. If wealth is counted in dollars, she had none. But if wealth is measured in sacrifice, then she was richer than any banker in town. Her mornings began before the roosters crow, when darkness still pressed against the windows. She would lace up her worn shoes, the same pair she had been repairing with needle and thread for years, and begin the 4-mile walk to the diner. Each step was an act of endurance, the soul slapping against pavement like a quiet drumbeat of devotion. She worked the breakfast shift, pouring coffee for men who barely looked her way, collecting tips in the form of nickels and the occasional dime. She carried the coins home in a rusted coffee can, tucked high on a shelf. That can became her private treasury, a vessel of hope. Each clink of metal against metal was a promise, a new pair of shoes for her daughter, a textbook for her son, perhaps even a Christmas turkey. But hunger was a companion she could never entirely banish. On nights when the cupboards held nothing but dry cornmeal, she would hum softly and turn up the radio, its scratchy gospel songs covering the growl of her stomach so the children wouldn't hear. They thought she was full. In truth, she often went to bed with nothing but water in her belly, saving what little food they had for the kids. Winter was the cruelest season. The wind slid through the cracks of their old house like a thief, stealing warmth. She sewed patches onto blankets until they looked like mosaics of survival. Sometimes she would hold the youngest close, letting her body heat serve as a furnace. "Mama's here," she whispered. "Love is greater than money." It was a phrase she repeated so often it became both prayer and lullaby. Her neighbors pitied her. Some even admired her, but pity does not fill a pantry, and admiration does not pay the rent. Still she endured. She always endured, because in her heart she believed a mother's love could outweigh the gravity of poverty. But love, as strong as it was, could not shield her from the slow corrosion taking place inside her children's hearts. They were growing, their world expanding beyond the patched blankets and hand-me-down toys. And with each passing year, shame began to outpace gratitude. She did not see it yet. She still thought the coffee can and her weary smile were enough. But storms often gather quietly, and when they break with fury. Children grow the way seasons change, quietly at first, then all at once. Her little ones, who once clung to her skirts and begged for bedtime stories, began to stretch taller, their voices deeper, their gazes wandering beyond the borders of home. At school, they noticed what others had always seen: the scuffed shoes, the lunch pail that carried nothing more than cornbread wrapped in wax paper, the whispers of classmates whose fathers owned shops, whose mothers wore dresses bought new, not patched. Her eldest daughter came home one afternoon, cheeks burning hotter than the Alabama sun. "Mama," she muttered, eyes fixed on the floor, "could you not walk me to school anymore?" The words stung, sharper than any slap, though the girl never meant them cruelly. It was shame speaking, shame inherited from the world outside their door. The boy, once her shadow, began to refuse hand-me-down clothes. "I can't wear this," he hissed, tugging at a patched jacket before tossing it onto the floor. "People laugh at me." She picked it up silently, smoothed the fabric, and folded it again. Her silence was not surrender. It was sorrow she had no language for. By the time high school came, the distance was no longer subtle. They met her at the gate with hurried steps, embarrassed by the sight of her waiting. At school events, they begged her to stay home. She told herself it was normal, that all teenagers craved independence. But a mother knows. She felt the chill, the slow retreat of affection, the way their laughter came more easily with others than with her. And yet she never stopped showing up. At her daughter's recital, she sat in the back, her dress plain against a sea of satin gowns. She clapped until her palms ached, though the girl avoided her eyes. At her son's football game, she cheered with a voice hoarse from work, while he scanned the bleachers and pretended not to see her. It was the first fracture, the first visible crack in the glass of family love, a fracture born not of cruelty, but of pride and the quiet poison of comparison. She carried it all in silence. She carried it as she always had, like one more burden added to her tired shoulders. But even glass, no matter how beautiful, cannot survive once the cracks begin to spread. Graduation day should have been a moment of triumph. For a child, for a family, for a mother who had walked miles and stitched nights together so that her daughter could stand in cap and gown. She rose before dawn, pressing her one decent dress with a warm iron. It was not new. It never had been. But she smoothed each wrinkle as if ironing away the years of hardship stitched into its seams. She even pinned a tiny silk flower, saved from her own wedding bouquet, to the collar, a secret symbol of hope, of love, of memory. When she arrived, the auditorium was buzzing with chatter, perfume, and proud fathers clutching cameras. She slipped quietly into the back row, hands folded tightly in her lap, her smile wide enough to mask the exhaustion in her bones. Then came the moment. Her daughter's name was called. The girl crossed the stage with practiced grace, diploma in hand. Cameras flashed. Applause swelled. Pride swelled in the mother's chest, too, until she rose to clap, waving with tears shining in her eyes. Her daughter's gaze found her just for a second, and then, like a knife, she turned away, pretended not to see, pretended that the woman in the faded dress and worn shoes was no one, a stranger. The mother froze. Her hands still raised faltered. The applause around her became a roar of absence, a sea that swallowed her joy. She sat back down, shrinking, clutching the silk flower at her collar as though it could shield her from the truth. After the ceremony, families clustered together for photographs. Mothers wrapped arms around daughters. Fathers kissed sons on the cheek. She lingered at the edge, hopeful. But her daughter slipped quickly into a car with friends, laughter spilling out as the door slammed shut. Not once did she look back. It was not words this time that cut her down. It was silence. The silence of being erased, of being unseen, of being unwanted in the one moment that should have belonged to both of them. On the walk home, she pressed her shoes harder against the pavement, as if each step could drown the ache inside. She whispered her mantra to herself. Love is greater than money. But for the first time, the words sounded thin, like a prayer no longer reaching heaven. That night, she placed the program from the ceremony into her coffee can of savings. Not for herself, for her daughter. Always for her children. Even when their shame had become louder than their gratitude. The glass had shattered in public now, and she knew it. But still, she endured. If graduation had been a wound, her son's wedding would become a scar she could never erase. Weddings, after all, are supposed to unite families. They are meant to gather the branches of a family tree beneath one roof to remind everyone of their roots. She had dreamed, quietly, secretly, of sitting in the pews, of watching her boy, the one who once fell asleep on her chest, pledge his life to another. But no invitation ever came. She waited, at first, excusing the silence. Maybe the mail was late. Maybe they were saving a surprise. She asked gently once, only to be met with a dismissive shrug. It's going to be small, Mama. You wouldn't fit in with her family. Her heart clenched at those words. Wouldn't fit. As if love were something that required dress codes or bank accounts. The day came and went. From her porch, she heard distant church bells ringing, their chimes carrying on the wind like a cruel reminder. She sat alone, a plate of cornbread cooling on the table, her best dress still folded neatly on the bed. Days later, an envelope arrived. Her hands trembled as she opened it, hoping for a note, a picture, some token that she had still been thought of. Inside, nothing. No letter. No photograph, just an empty card, its blankness louder than any insult. It was not forgetfulness, it was intentional. A message written in silence. You are not wanted, not here, not in this new life. She placed the envelope beside the coffee can. She did not cry. Her tears had long since learned to hide. But she sat for hours in the dim kitchen light, staring at that envelope as though it contained the whole story of her life. Sacrifice answered with shame. Love answered with erasure. That night she walked outside, the Alabama sky stretching wide above her. The stars flickered faintly, far away, untouchable. She whispered again her mantra, though it quavered now, a thread fraying. Love is greater than money. But as the words drifted into the night, she wondered, what if love was no longer enough? Illness does not announce itself with fanfare. It slips quietly into the body. the way frost creeps along a window pane, slow, invisible, and relentless. It began with a cough. At first she brushed it off, telling herself it was nothing more than the dust from scrubbing floors or the grease from late-night shifts at the diner. But the cough lingered. It deepened, rattling in her chest like chains dragged across stone. Soon her legs grew weak, her breath short. The diner manager, once sympathetic, became impatient. "You're scaring customers, coughing over their food," he said sharply. "I need someone who can work." The next day, her hours were cut. A week later, she was replaced altogether. No job, no steady paycheck. The coffee can, once the sound of hope, grew lighter each day. She stretched the coins the way she stretched meals, watering down soup, slicing bread thinner, boiling bones twice for broth. Hunger became her shadow again. Only this time there was no husband to share the load. No children eager to ease her pain. The house grew colder that winter. The drafts slipped under the doors and through cracked panes. To keep warm, she gathered every scrap of fabric she had, old shirts, torn aprons, the hem of a dress too faded to wear, and stitched them together into a blanket. It was lopsided, heavy, and homely, but it kept her alive. She called it her patchwork of survival. One night, curled beneath that blanket, she dreamed of her children. She dreamed they came home bringing laughter, bringing warmth. But when she woke, there was only silence. The house was empty. The only sound was the whistle of wind slipping through the eaves. She pressed her hand into her chest, whispering to herself, as if the words alone might keep her alive. "Love is greater than money." But the phrase trembled now. It sounded like something fragile, something breaking. For the first time, she wondered if anyone still believed those words besides her. She was growing weaker, and her children were farther away than ever. The call came on a damp Sunday afternoon. Rain tapped against the window as she held the receiver close, her patched blanket draped over her shoulders. It was her youngest, the one she had once carried on her hip through thunderstorms. His voice was cold, clipped, as if reading from a script. "Mama, you can't stay in that house anymore. It's embarrassing. The neighbors talk. We can't keep pretending." She swallowed hard. "Pretending what, child?" "That you're still part of this family." The words dropped heavy, each syllable a stone sinking into her chest. She pressed the phone tighter, as if closeness could soften cruelty. "I gave you everything I had. I gave you." "You gave us poverty," he cut in, sharp as broken glass. "And we're done carrying it." The line went dead. Silence buzzed in her ear like static. Within a week, the notice came. Her name was no longer on the lease. Her son had arranged it. There was no room for argument, no appeal, just a box of her belongings left on the porch. The coffee can, the patched blanket, a handful of worn dresses. She stood on the curb that evening, rain soaking her shoes, watching as the house, her house, locked her out. She had scrubbed those floors, rocked her babies to sleep in those rooms, prayed at that kitchen table when the cupboards were bare. And now it belonged to others. Neighbors passed by, some with pity in their eyes, some avoiding her gaze, but no one stopped. The shame of poverty is a disease most people fear catching. That night, she spread her patchwork blanket over a bench at the bus stop. The metal was cold against her bones, the wind sharper than knives. She held the coffee can against her chest, not because it was heavy with savings. There were only a few coins left, but because it was heavy with memories. "You don't even fit to be called our mother." The words echoed in her mind, circling like vultures. And yet, as she closed her eyes against the rain, she whispered once more, a prayer for no one but herself. "Love is greater than money." The world might not have believed it. Her children certainly didn't. But clinging to that truth was the only thing keeping her alive. Morning came gray and brittle, the kind of morning when the world itself seems tired. She was sitting on the church steps, her patchwork blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, when a man in a brown cap approached. He carried a leather satchel, worn but dignified, and in his hand was a white envelope. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked. His voice was measured, professional. She hesitated. It had been years since anyone addressed her by her proper name. "Yes," she whispered. He handed her the envelope with a small bow of his head. "From a law office, you'll want to read it?" And just as quickly as he had come, he was gone, swallowed by the hum of the waking street. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The paper inside was thick, official, bearing a stamp she had never seen before. She squinted at the words, her education limited, but the meaning was clear enough. It was about her brother. Her brother, who had left Alabama decades ago, chasing work in the North. Rumor had it he had done well for himself. Factories, investments, something about real estate. But she had never asked. Pride had kept her from writing letters. Poverty had kept her from visiting. Years turned into silence. Silence turned into distance. Now the letter told her he was gone, and that his affairs required her presence. She clutched the paper to her chest, stunned. It felt like a voice from the grave, calling her, pulling her out of the shadows where her children had cast her. For the first time in years, the future held not just emptiness, but a question. What could he possibly have left behind? She did not dare to imagine riches. That sort of hope was dangerous. And yet, as the church bells began to toll, she allowed herself the smallest flicker of wonder. Maybe, just maybe, the story of her life was not finished after all. The law office smelled of leather and old paper, the kind of place where lives are measured not in years, but in signatures. She sat nervously in a high-backed chair, her patched blanket folded neatly in her lap, out of place among the polished oak furniture and brass lamps. Across from her, the attorney adjusted his spectacles, his voice calm but deliberate, as if each word carried the weight of stone. "Mrs. Carter," he began, "your late brother, Mr. Elijah Carter, left behind considerable holdings. His instructions were clear. His estate, valued at approximately $60 million, is to be passed to you as his sole surviving kin." The words seemed to echo in the room, impossible, almost cruel in their contrast. $60 million. She blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. For a woman who measured her wealth in pennies clinking inside a coffee can, 60 million was not a number. It was a dream, a fairy tale, a figure too large to hold inside her chest. "I think you must have made a mistake," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I am nobody. I have nothing." The attorney leaned forward, his gaze steady. "That was precisely his point. He knew your struggles, Mrs. Carter. He admired the way you lived with dignity, even in hardship. He wanted to honor that." Her hands trembled, clutching the armrest as if the ground beneath her might give way. In that moment, all the nights she had gone hungry, all the winters she had stitched patches onto blankets, all the years she had been shamed and abandoned, they seemed to blur together into something both bitter and luminous. She thought of her children, the ones who had turned their backs, the ones who had said she no longer fit to be called their mother. Would they come running now, once in a while they heard? Would they weep at her feet, not out of love, but of greed? She closed her eyes. For decades she had whispered one mantra: love is greater than money. Now fate had placed the test in her hands. And for the first time in her life, she held the power to decide who would learn that truth and who would suffer from ignoring it. Most people, upon inheriting $60 million, would start with indulgence. New cars, sprawling houses, the kind of luxuries they once only glimpsed through shop windows. But not her. Her first purchase was not a diamond, but a deed. A crumbling building on the corner of Jefferson Street, a place the city had forgotten. With careful renovation, it became a shelter. Warm desks, hot meals, a place for women and children who had nowhere else to go. Her second act was smaller, but no less powerful. She began a scholarship fund named after her late brother Elijah. The first recipients were children from neighborhoods like hers, kids who carried the same patched shoes and hollow stomachs she once knew too well. When she handed them envelopes with acceptance letters inside, she saw in their eyes a spark she had longed to see in her own children. Neighbors who had once pitied her now stood in awe. They watched the homeless widow become a benefactor, her name whispered in churches and schools with reverence. Reporters came too, eager to tell the story of a woman who had risen from rags to unexpected riches. But she never sought their praise. She moved quietly, choosing projects that mended broken places. A soup kitchen on one street, a health clinic on another, repairs for the roof of the church where she once slept under the eaves. And through it all, she lived simply. She still wore her patched blanket on cold nights. She still carried the old coffee can, though now it held letters of gratitude instead of nickels and dimes. To the world, she had become a woman of power. To herself, she remained what she had always been, a mother who believed love was greater than money. Only now, for the first time, she had the means to prove it. But power has a way of drawing shadows. And far away her children, those who had cast her aside, began to hear whispers of their mother's fortune. The story was not over. In truth, it had only just begun. It began with whispers. The same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid her now leaned over fences, telling anyone who would listen, "Have you heard about Mrs. Carter, the widow they left out in the cold? She's saving this city." The shelter on Jefferson Street filled quickly, its doors opening to women and children who had nowhere else to go. The soup kitchen served steaming plates of stew each evening, laughter and warmth replacing hunger and despair. At the small clinic she funded, doctors treated patients who had lived for years without medicine. For the first time, people in those forgotten corners of town felt seen. Her name, once spoken with pity, now carried weight. Newspapers ran headlines. Homeless widow turns fortune into hope. Church pastors quoted her story from the pulpit. Strangers stopped her on the street just to press her hands and say thank you. And then, inevitably, the whispers reached her children. At first, they didn't believe it. The mother they had abandoned, the woman they had called a burden, suddenly she was in every headline, every Sunday sermon, every neighborhood tale. But disbelief quickly soured into envy. "How could she keep this from us?" her eldest daughter hissed, her hands trembling over the morning paper. Her son clenched his jaw, eyes burning. 60 million. Do you know what that kind of money could do for us? They had measured worth in status, in possessions, in the approval of others. And in that measurement, they discovered a bitter truth. Their mother, whom they had cast aside, now stood taller than them all. Yet she never sought to confront them. She did not send for them. She did not flaunt her wealth before their eyes. Instead, she kept building, kept giving, her quiet purpose steady as the sunrise. For her, it was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving that love, her mantra, her creed, had always been stronger than the shame they carried. But the children's shame was turning to hunger now. Hunger not for bread, but for inheritance. And hunger, once awakened, can be dangerous. It began with an obituary, a short column in the local paper printed beneath the fold. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, beloved benefactor of Jefferson Street Shelter and Elijah Scholarship Fund, passed away quietly in her sleep. The city mourned. Churches tolled their bells. Neighbors laid flowers at the steps of her shelter. Volunteers wept openly, their voices breaking as they told stories of how she had lifted them from despair. For them, it was the passing of a saint. But for her children, the news struck differently. They didn't cry. They didn't kneel. They didn't whisper prayers. They demanded answers. How much had she left behind? Where would it all go now? Within hours they gathered, not at her bedside, for she had not truly gone, but at the polished office of the same attorney who had once delivered her brother's will. Their eyes burned not with grief, but with expectation. Their voices hissed with urgency. "We're her blood," the son declared, his fist pounding the oak desk. "The estate belongs to us." "Yes," the daughter added quickly, "we'll divide it equally. We deserve that much after everything." The attorney's face was impassive, his spectacles catching the afternoon light. "Her wishes will be revealed at the reading of the will," he said evenly. Meanwhile, in a quieter room just beyond the city, Evelyn Carter sat in a wooden chair, listening, hidden, alive. She had staged her own passing, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. She needed to see the truth, whether her children's hearts could be softened by loss, or if greed would consume them whole. As she heard their voices rise, sharp and bitter, she felt the answer cut through her like winter wind. They were not mourning a mother. They were circling an inheritance. Her patch blanket rested across her knees, and she touched it gently, her lips forming the words she had whispered her entire life. Love is greater than money. But now, with her children gathered like vultures over her supposed grave, she wondered if love could still reach them, or if money had already devoured what little was left. The room was heavy with expectation, the kind of silence that tightens like a noose. Evelyn's children sat at the polished oak table, their clothes sharp, their expressions taut with greed disguised as grief. The attorney shuffled papers slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of each second build like thunder before a storm. Finally, he spoke. The last will and testament of Mrs. Evelyn Carter. The eldest daughter leaned forward, her fingers digging into the armrest. The son tapped his foot nervously, his jaw set. They were ready for numbers, for bank accounts, for deeds and checks. Instead, the attorney read words that pierced deeper than any figure. To my children, who once told me I was unfit to be called their mother, who turned away when I had nothing, I leave no portion of my estate, not out of cruelty, but out of truth. Money cannot buy love, and love cannot be inherited like property. It must be lived. Gasps filled the room. The daughter's face drained pale. The son slammed his hand on the table. "This can't be legal," he barked. But the attorney did not flinch. He continued, "My entire estate, valued at $60 million, is to be placed in trust for the people who need it most. The homeless, the widows, the children who walk the same roads I once walked. The shelters, scholarships, and clinics already established will be funded in perpetuity. The only path for my children to share in this legacy is not by blood, but by repentance. If they choose humility, if they labor in service to those in need, then and only then will they be welcomed back, not into wealth, but into family." The room erupted, anger, denial, bargaining. The daughter wept into her manicured hands. The son shouted at the attorney as if volume could alter ink on a page. But nothing changed. The will was final. And though they did not know it, Evelyn herself was alive, listening from beyond the veil of secrecy she had created. Her heart ached, not with triumph, but with the sorrow of a mother who longed for her children's souls more than their obedience. The will was not punishment. It was a mirror, a test. Would they see themselves clearly at last? Or would they remain blind, chasing a fortune that no longer belonged to them? In the weeks after the will was read, the Carter children walked through the city not as heirs, but as outcasts. Their names, once spoken with admiration in their circles of wealth and society, now carried a stain. The children who abandoned their mother. Whispers followed them like shadows. At first they raged. They hired lawyers, searched for loopholes, challenged the will. But every path ended the same. Their mother's words, written in unshakable ink. No wealth, no inheritance, only a condition, service. So reluctantly, bitterly, they went where they had never gone before, the shelter on Jefferson Street. The eldest daughter arrived in heels too fine for the cracked pavement. She gagged at the smell of stew boiling in great pots, the scent of onions and old wood mingling in the air. Yet when a thin girl with hollow eyes reached for her hand, she froze. For the first time, she saw hunger not as an inconvenience, but as a wound. Her brother fared no better. Assigned to scrub floors at the soup kitchen, he cursed under his breath, his hands raw from bleach and water. But as the hours dragged on, something shifted. A boy no older than 12 sat nearby, smiling at him with a gratitude that needed no words. The boy reminded him of himself, back when life was simpler, back when love was enough. Day after day, they returned. What began as duty turned slowly, painfully, into something else. The eldest daughter found herself staying late, folding blankets, listening to the stories of women abandoned as their mother had been. Her brother began repairing leaky pipes, not for pay, but because someone had to. It was not easy. Pride dies slowly. Shame does not fade quickly. But service has a way of wearing down the sharp edges of arrogance. And all the while, hidden in plain sight, Evelyn watched. From a quiet bench in the corner, wrapped in her patchwork blanket, she saw her children begin to bend. Not broken yet, not healed either, but bending. Her heart whispered, maybe love can still reach them. The trial was not finished. Redemption is never instant, but the first steps had been taken, and sometimes the first steps are the hardest of all. The day came when those children were summoned once more to the attorney's office. They arrived not in polished arrogance, but in worn humility. Their clothes were simpler now, their hands rougher from weeks of labor. Pride had been stripped away, replaced by something they had never expected to feel: remorse. The attorney cleared his throat, his voice steady as ever. Your mother left one final addendum to her will. It was to be opened only after a season of your service. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal on a smaller envelope. Inside, written in Evelyn's careful, uneven hand, were words that carried more weight than any dollar. My children, I do not leave you money, for money cannot save you. I leave you instead a choice. Continue in pride, and you will remain poor in spirit forever. But if you walk in humility, if you serve those you once despised, then you will find wealth that outlives any inheritance. Love is greater than money, always. If you wish to find me, you must first find yourselves. The daughter wept openly, tears falling onto the oak table. The son bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with grief. In that moment, they realized the inheritance they had wasted was not the $60 million. It was their mother herself, her years, her sacrifices, her love. And then, from a side door, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, steady, familiar. Evelyn entered, wrapped in her patchwork blanket, her eyes soft but unyielding. Gasps filled the room as her children rose to their feet, stunned. Mama! The son choked, his voice breaking. She raised a hand. I am not here for apologies. I am here for truth. I wanted you to know the poverty I carried was not in my pockets. It was in your hearts, and only you can mend it. They fell to their knees, not for money, but for forgiveness. She did not embrace them quickly. Forgiveness, like service, had to be proven. But she laid a hand on each head, her touch gentle as falling rain. You are still my children, she whispered. But remember, love is greater than money. It always has been, and it always will be. Years later, the shelter still stood, the scholarships still funded, the clinics still open. Her name lived on, not in bank ledgers, but in lives changed. And when people told her story, they did not speak first of the fortune. They spoke of a mother who turned suffering into grace, betrayal into redemption, and poverty into a legacy of love. And at the end of every retelling, one question lingered in the air, left for every listener to wrestle with. If you were the mother, would you forgive?